Gene and Dan Potter live a quiet life, surrounded by woods and wildlife in northeastern Pennsylvania. It's a stark contrast to 10 years ago living in a Manhattan apartment just a few blocks from the World Trade Center. Gene worked on the 81st floor of the first tower hit on the morning of 9/11.
All of a sudden, this massive explosion rocked the building, and we literally swayed from side to side. And what first came to me is, this is not your time. We are with you. Your brother is with you. I lost my brother in 1999.
Gene believes it was the voice of God, loud and clear, a message in the midst of chaos.
You're thinking, is this building going to fall? And I'm up 81 flights. How am I getting out of here?
She made it to the staircase as the floor became engulfed in flames.
My heart was palpitating a mile a minute as I was going down the staircase. And what also came to me is, you and Dan will be blessed with a beautiful life. You will go north. And I saw like green trees. This is all while this is happening. And I'm in a very nervous state. But the messages were coming in.
Gene believes God was reassuring her and prodding her to keep moving down the staircase.
In the 20s, we start seeing firemen, which gave us all a sense of relief. One of whom was Vinnie Giamona, who was my husband's lieutenant at Ladder 5. And I grabbed his arm. I said, "Vinnie, be safe." And I will never forget the look on his face that day. It would have been his 40th birthday. And he left behind a wife and 4 children, 4 little girls who are now grown, but I will never forget the look on his face.
Lieutenant Vinnie Giamona was one of 343 New York firefighters who died that dark day. Gene's husband Dan, a firefighter at the time, knew 60 of them. When the terrorists struck, he was on Staten Island, but quickly raced to Manhattan to make sure Gene was safe, not knowing that she made it out of the North Tower before it collapsed. It wasn't until he was a block or 2 away that he realized the magnitude of the situation.
Different sized body parts, and there's big pieces and there's small pieces, and it's all over the place.
Dan arrived at Ground Zero to help and had to take cover when the South Tower collapsed, and later the North Tower.
It sounded like a freight train, or maybe 100 times more, and you just figure with that amount of noise, and you know it's coming down around you. It's just a matter of time.
Debris and concrete pelted Dan, but he says God kept him alive, and the big hit never came. Covered in ash, the battered firefighter refused to give up his search for his wife and went back to their apartment. Dan pounded on the door of their Battery Park City apartment, but no one answered. It was then he thought that he had lost Gene. The overwhelmed firefighter left the building and sat on this bench and prayed. It was at that moment an Associated Press photographer snapped a photo of him, a photo that would be seen around the world.
I'm praying. I'm praying to Jesus. I'm praying for clarity. Just what do you want me to do? What should I do?
Dan believes Jesus directed him to go back to the apartment. It was there the phone rang. His father was crying and called to check on Dan. He also told Dan where Gene was, and Dan was on his way.
And I saw her, standing there, and she's all upset, and she looked at me kind of wide-eyed, like, what are you doing here like that?
And in he walks in his bunker gear, covered, and his eyes were blood red. There's just blood in his eyes. And I said, "Where were you?" He said, "You don't want to know." And we hugged. It was just unbelievable. We are so grateful for what Jesus has done in our life.
Gene chronicles the couple's amazing story of survival in a new book, By the Grace of God, a 9/11 survivor's story of love, hope, and healing.
He was with all of us that day, and I don't want people to think that like we were so special because we were saved. I mean, it wasn't our time, and he was with those who were passing over, and it's just a great privilege to speak about him.
Life has been tough at times over the last 10 years. The Potters have dealt with post-traumatic stress disorder, and Dan had to retire as a firefighter because of the injuries he suffered on 9/11. Yet, in spite of the attacks and the difficulties that have followed, the faith of Gene and Dan remains strong, and they hope those who read and hear their story will also trust in God.
God is a loving God. If you turn over your pain to Him, He will pull you through it. He will heal your heart.
I trust Him implicitly, And I gave him my life with that. I just, use me for your glory and just whatever I can do for you.
These days, Dan is a national fire instructor and volunteers for the Red Cross. Gene counsels female inmates at a correctional center. Even though they now live in Pennsylvania, they still consider themselves New Yorkers, grateful for a second chance at life. Mark Martin, CBN News, Pennsylvania and New York.